Welcome to my virtual audience, wherever you may be. I hope you've gotten used to this isolation stuff and doing everything with your computer instead of talking to real people. There may be advantages, disadvantages, we'll see. What we're going to talk about here today is understanding uniform irrigation fertigation and the tools that we have available to do that and just what it means for your eventual crop production. The key points, of course, of what makes a crop is optimal photosynthesis, maximum carbon dioxide uptake, because that's where you build your sugars and your and your final fruiting yield. This is a micrograph of the underside of a leaf. These little portholes here are the stomata through which water vapor, your transpiration, blows out and you suck your carbon dioxide in. Graphically, this is what it looks like. More water equals more yield. Actually, more conductance provides for more CO2 assimilation. This is a linear function. So of course that means when you've got stress conditions, you're not making the sugars. The converse of this, of course, is waterlogged conditions. We've all seen dead trees from Phytophthora and wimpy parts of cotton and alfalfa fields that aren't transpiring because the roots have no oxygen. We're going to take a real brief moment to review the impact of this understanding of water management and conductance with what we've seen in the almond research over the last 40 years. In 1977, these were the crop coefficients published by the University of California, which basically came up with a normal year of 42 inches of ET. In 2002, after about 15 years of my personal observations, measurements of field, I published these crop coefficients, which come up to about 52.3 inches. And these are right close to the standard of what the Almond Board's recommending right now. Then the top numbers were published in 2012. This was a 4-year combined average of the Patrick Brown potassium nitrogen fertility trials, in which we hit 4,000 and 5,000 pound yields. But if you look at this transpiration here on an individual tree basis and the yield as a function of the water that tree used, you don't get any significant trend after 50 inches. Basically, every tree getting 50 inches cranked out a maximum yield. Now, we went to another field over in the same area and looked at large-scale yield off of plots at a 48-inch application versus 56-inch application and a 275 pound adequate nitrogen fertility rate, and we had 16% reduced less water, that's 56 to 48, reduced yield by 9%. The final trial I was involved with went from 2013 through 17 on the east side. This is a west side trial, this is a west side trial, this is east side driver sandy loam. And we had increasing yield all the way up to 110% of ET. That's a very linear function. We had a benefit of getting off the curve with 85% RDI, and this guy was about equivalent to the 100% yield statistically. But the bottom line is you lost a good chunk. For every 10% decline, you were losing 200 to 300 pounds of almonds. Up in Northern California, with a little less ET pressure than we've got down in Southern Cal, Alan Fulton and Ken Shackle did a 4-year whole split RDI irrigation trial, in which they had no difference in yield at all over all 4 years that they did the trial, from 2005 through 8, and they cranked out 4,000 pound yields in 2008, and they did it on 42 and 48 inches of water. So Northern Cal, a little bit different animal from the San Joaquin, but if you look at the final word on the subject that was published by Dave Goldhammer. This is an accumulation of all these trials from Spain to California, and the bottom line was 20% irrigation deficit reduces your yield by 10%. Okay, so if that's the case, how do we translate that into understanding uniformity in a field and the final impact on yield? Well, it seems kind of obvious at this point. You got that 10% or 20% irrigation deficit side of the field, you're going to have your yield reduced by 10%. So we're going to look at the issues that give you that optimal efficiency and uniformity water balance across your field. We've got 3 areas that impact our irrigation management. The natural factors, that's basically the dirt and dirt, climate, and soil that God gave you. And then the proposed crop, the life cycle, breeding characteristics, the particular growth demand, fruiting demand, shoot push, which dictates your nitrogen and other fertility requirements. And then right here, engineering factors. Those are the ones we have the most control over, and what we're going to focus on pretty much for this particular talk. Monitoring these engineering factors, changing them, and seeing how that affects some of these natural factors like soil water holding capacity. So where do you start? Hands and knees. A little prayer doesn't hurt, but you're going to have to get down to check your pressure regulators and your drip flow in the orchard. We're going to try and do this in a 3-point sermon. We really don't have time to go into irrigation crop salinity tolerance, but we're going to start with understanding soil water holding characteristics. Your dirt's got more secret than the CIA. You got to get out there with backhoe and hand twist augers at least, and identify the zones where you've got your predominance of rooting, other points of maybe high calcic or confining layers, excessive silt like in the topsoil of this. Your predominant water use is going to come out of this layer. So if you know where that is, and as you're looking at a proposed planting, this field went into pistachios, not almond dirt, then you're able to get your saturation percentage analyses from your laboratory data as well as the salinity, and you're going to identify just where those prime layers are. And eventually you're going to total up that depth. We're going to get to that in a minute, what size is your cup. But you can, with just a twist auger, pull up your sample, and you can come up with your own soil texture using this ribbon method. This chart is mounted to my website, and I believe Provo and Pritchard's providing those web links for your access later on. So you can figure out have I sandy loam, sandy clay loam, sandy clay, and the difference is kind of like everything less than an inch in the ribbon, 1 to 2 inches, 2.5, greater than 2 inches, 2.5 on the ribbon, and it will give you an indication of these soil types. Those soil types then provide a water holding capacity to tell you how big this cup is. And your job as an optimal irrigation manager is to figure out what my soil available water is, my allowable depletion, that's usually about 50% of that total available, and as you have an ET, these are mature almond ETs, day by day, I come up with 2.1 inches of depletion. Can that soil and rooting at depth hold that much water so that I don't stress the plant? And if I've got purple fan jets that whack out 2 inches a day, can I use a 24-hour irrigation to recharge that? Now, of course, the flood irrigation is even more challenging. If we're talking about essential and the basics to give you the best irrigation, can a simple flood system with 8-inch alfalfa valves provide you just as good uniformity as a micro irrigation system? Usually we say no, because what we don't know is what this actual infiltration rate is at any given moment. So that last slide was Wasco Sandy Loam near Shafter. Here's these big 18-inch gate valves in Modesto run at 2,000 GPM on series loamy sand. Can those two be as uniform as this fancy microsystem that has up-to-date sand media filtration, computerized control, multiple injection pumps for fertigation, and then do I need this much equipment? ET towers to tell me what the ET of that specific orchard is. Soil moisture sensors to tell me what my soil moisture reserve is. Pressure bomb readings to tell me what the plant stress is. Yes, no, depends. So nothing new here, but we just want to walk through this to lay groundwork for some of the opportunities you have as a grower to make your irrigation optimal. Am I going to tell you got to be scientific about your irrigation? Well, look, this is the Webster definition for scientific, pertaining to science, which is systematic knowledge of the physical or material world gained through observation and experimentation. That sure sounds like a farmer to me. That's what you're out there doing every day, looking at your field and looking at your crop. So we're going to continue on with this understanding bit. So back to our flood field. We asked, what's the big deal about it? And one answer, each field, crop, climate, grower has unique characteristics. The majority acreage in California is still flood irrigated. Actually, we're just about half and half right now in permanent crops. Probably a little more micro and permanent crops, but with all the flood crops in California, row crops, we're still major flood irrigation. So infiltration can be anywhere from 1.5 up to 12 inches for a given soil and given irrigation. Sealing like this is very, very common in some of these class 1 high micaceous zeolite clay sandy loams, and when you look at the specific changes in infiltration on this Wasco sandy loam when it was flood irrigated for cotton, then you can easily drop to only 50% of the previous irrigation in terms of your infiltration over 24 hours. And then you can drop another 50%, more than 50% with a July irrigation. Come along with some gypsum, you improve it. That's why a lot of you guys, when you're out in the almond setting on these sandy loams, that's why you're using gyp injection machines, so you don't get excessive runoff. Okay. Now we're going to ditch the flood system, and I want engineered how much water is going to get pumped out on that field. I can count on that being the same for every hour, every day. That's why we go to the microsystem where we whack on 0.6 to 1.5 inches a day. Okay, now the difference with this system versus flood is what happens. Am I wetting the entire root zone now, or am I only wetting part of the root zone? Well, you obviously know that answer, and we're just wetting part of the root zone. So if I've got a 50 to 60% visual surface coverage, then does that mean my wetted volume is 50% of the whole field? Or am I subbing out, getting more water beyond that? Well, I am subbing out beyond that. This field probably has about a 60 to 65% wetted volume under these micro sprinklers. We did a very dense catch can analysis on every square foot under that fan jet, and we come up with these mountainous peaks for a 24-hour irrigation, where you've got as much as 8.5, almost 9 inches in the very wettest areas. So you look at that and you say, wait a minute, now what's this? This is what we call the rain shadow around the fan jet. If you're doing micro sprinklers, you never want to put your tensiometers and your sampling point for moisture within 2 foot of the fan jet because the water's blowing out beyond that. So at least in the top part of that profile, when you look at what you actually get down to a 6 foot depth in the spread of that water content across that tree and row, this is what it looks like. Now our variability for the total of that 6 feet is really only about 16 to 12 inches. Nowhere near as much difference as that instantaneous surface application. And if you look at the spread of water, I get this very full up to about 85% of total field capacity all the way out to 10 foot from the row. The fan jet is spreading about a 6 foot radius, but I'm getting out to 10 foot. I've got almost a 20 foot coverage with that subbing. What about drip? Look at the surface wetting patterns on this drip. You can see, whoa, wait a minute, I've only got 10 to 15% of the area wetted here. This is the same orchard as that fan jet, the same soil, and when you look at, again, a neutron probe analysis of how that water spreads out, I'm not getting it in the top 1.5, 0 to 1.5 foot, but when I go 1.5 down to a 6 foot depth, I have water subbing out 8 to almost 10 foot under those drips. This is beautiful dirt. That's the kind of dirt you want. You don't always get it. And so what I've done is I've made this table where you have the different soil textures that you can estimate by your field method and what the USDA stipulates. Here's the available soil moisture for those different textures. And if you notice, the available moisture for everything from a fine sandy loam to a loam down to a clay, it's almost around 2 inches. So that helps. Your subbing, though, is going to change. Look at this subbing diameter as your soil types change. So you could grab this table and it gives you an estimate of the hours it's going to take you to refill with this much days reserve down to your stress point at about 50% fill. Look on the website. You got to spend more time looking at that. We want to try and get through this. So monitoring soil moisture and irrigation uniformity impacts on yield. How do we do that? All of us have seen this kind of an alfalfa field before where the tail end either gets drowned out or it gets droughted out because your runtime is either too long and you got pounded water here, or it's too short. You collect salts and the thing is deficit. Around it, and this is why most of the trees have gone to micro irrigation, is beautifully irrigated fan jet almonds. So how does this work out in a schematic engineering way? This is the classic furrow analysis of distribution uniformity, and the definition is simply the low quarter infiltration, that's down on the bottom end of the field here, divided by the average for the whole field. And the reason flood irrigation works is because that infiltration curve declines significantly over time. Half your infiltration is going to happen in the first 6 hours. And so if I've only got 6 hours on the tail end of the field, I'm still going to get half the water I got up at the head end. Now, okay, obviously here deep percolation down there. So if you take a look at that, of how that plays out in an almond field, again, this is near Shafter. This is the tail end. It got salted and droughted out. The Monterey's defoliated. The nonpareils had a ton of mites in them. This is the head end of that field. The exact same 2 rows. And they look beautiful. That's because there's always more on time at the beginning of this field than there is at the end of this field. This field did not have a tailwater return system. a field with a tailwater return system in almonds can avoid these kind of drown out type of problem. And I have measured a 95% DU in flood irrigated almonds with a tailwater return system. A drip system is no magic cure for preventing flooding. This happens to be a Delano sandy loam with severe infiltration problems, and this double line drip system on 24 and 48 hour sets would just waterlog the top 1.5 foot of root zone. Below 1.5 foot, this field was dry, but the Poria Phytophthora just took out a bunch of trees in the top part of this field. So a drip system is no magic cure. Okay, how do we determine the DU in a microsystem? You get out on your hands and knees after you've said your prayers. You measure the flow rate out of the individual fan jet in this case, or little catch cans under the drippers, and you end up looking at the total volume from the high volume catch down to low volume catch. Right here is one of the biggest problems of low DU in drip fields. If you put safety screens in these hoses, my recommendation is throw them out. In 40 years and hundreds of fields with thousands of micro irrigation in California, I've only heard of one grower saving his drip hoses by having the screens in here because his filter blew out. Most of the time you get this kind of problem, and the pressure in that hose isn't worth spit. Obviously there's some precipitation problems and issues that can be difficulty, not with micro sprinklers so much, but with drips, sure. Then if you look at topography elements, this is why compensating drip emitters were invented. So it can make up for pressure changes across the field as you get farther away from the pump, and so you can make up for these elevation differences. This was a fan jet system which did not. And the second thing that we do on an engineering standpoint is we put these pressure regulators in the field as we outfit a quarter. If you got a quarter section, 155 net acre block, then you're spanning a half a mile from east to west, north to south, and your filter station's over in one corner. So you've got to regulate, throttle down the pressure where it's near the pump. This is the old style, just a gate valve, and you had an upstream Schrader valve, a downstream, and you put your pressure gauge on the downstream and go through the block about 3 or 4 times to get all your pressures the same. Of course, that all goes south once the filters start clogging up and their pressure changes. So automatic regulators have a pilot on them that help you maintain, theoretically, a uniform pressure across the manifold that is served by that regulator. All well and good. So automatic means you never have to check them, right? Yeah, wrong. Here is gophers that have filled in a pressure regulator box, and the top was left open and filled up with nuts during harvest. When this thing was last checked, who knows? And if you don't keep an eye on checking those regulators and ensuring that you do some kind of chlorine maintenance hose flushing, then here's what you let yourself in for, okay? This is a 1-inch double line drip irrigated almond orchard, and here's a pretty good DU, 90%. The way that falls out is in your drier area at a 90% DU, that means your dry area is 90% of what the field average is. So dry quarter, 0.9 inches, but you have a 22% difference from the wet quarter. From the wetter part of that field, it's getting 1.12 inches. Still though, you're kind of within 10% of the average, pretty good. If you go to a 70% DU, which actually used to be considered excellent for flood. And a lot of people still consider 80% good for micro, but this becomes a real problem. This is what happens when you don't flush hoses and when you let those regulators get messed up and bad pressures from one to the other. Your low quarter is now 0.7 inches. You're 30% off the average, but your wet quarter now is 1.42 inches. You're 0.42 inches more. You are more than double the irrigation difference across half that field. So you're gonna rot out trees here, you're going to drought out trees here, and that costs your yield. If you're trying to be optimally efficient, hit that 0.75 nitrogen use efficiency that the water board wants you to achieve for your coalitions, then if you have a DU of 70%, that means a 300-pound application only gets you 210 pounds on your dry quarter, 426 pounds, with probably 150 pounds of that getting leached out on the wet quarter. But you're on the 90% DU, you're coming in 270 to 336, and that's going to provide for optimal yield on that entire field. So let's take a look at a field quarter section example right here. This was an east side field right near Laredo and I-99, driver sandy loam. This was actually the sectional water pressure regulator measurements that we made on the west side of the field and the east side of the field the year before we initiated that ET trial. So you can see we've got everything from 45 inches for the whole year, and the average stem water potential was negative 13.4 bars, up to 58 inches in the wet quarter down here, which was lower elevation of the field, and negative 11.2 bars for that whole system. The trunk diameters down here were 83.1 centimeters. They were 75 centimeters up here. Not a big difference. So if you use a DU calculation and these numbers for the whole year, not just a single event analysis, we have 92.5% DU, pretty dang good. Stem water potential DU was 87%. The trunk diameter DU, and we usually consider trunk diameter woody accumulation one of the sensitive things to water application. Those trees were 96% uniform. So that made us feel pretty good about going with our ET trial. But when you look at the differences across the season, that western end, which is over here, versus the eastern end over here, had this much difference in stem water potential the whole season. And that did create a real difference in the ability of these trees to pump out nuts versus the ability of these trees to pump out nuts. We didn't see it that much on the whole field basis, but that is a reality. What tools do you have to understand how that might play out for whole field? One of the best that we have is this aerial remote sensing, either with a lower elevation plane image. This is a series image at 4,000 feet. A lot of companies are out there doing satellite images, which of course don't have the resolution, but this is what our trial looked like in the middle of when we were doing this for 2015. These are the 70-80% treatments in red and yellow, and here's your 110-100% treatments getting the blue. We had a very good correlation of the irrigation amount by the series conductance, or what they call their crop water stress. So bottom line is that aerial imagery provided a really good snapshot. If I see this in the field, I'm going to go in and say, uh-oh, bad regulator, clean the hoses, do what I need to correct that. Now, what about young almonds? under micro sprinklers. Here you've got a pretty good uniformity of growth, but you're going to blow off about 50% of the water to evaporation with this guy. So how do I keep track of this on a seasonal basis? Again, the soil information, soil surveys are going to tell you about your layering. Your backhoe pits are very important to get the worm's eye view out there, where your roots proliferate, and the differences in more loam versus more sand. And of course, the sampling is important. Hand augering is if you don't have an auger in your truck, for 30 years as I was going out consulting with growers, I said the first time's freebie, but if you call me back and you haven't taken your auger out and dug your own hole, I'm not coming. This is one of the best tools, cheapest tools out there to see what's happening. Composite samples are the best for a orchard-wide understanding of what your salinity is and maybe your moisture content. These 4 buckets help you track maybe top foot, second, third, fourth foot. Hand push probes are a very good, quick way. The AMS manufacturing, they make a hammer probe that helps you get into tight soils. So what about in situ devices like tensiometers that can help us? Most of you are familiar with the tensiometer. It's been around for almost 70 years in terms of available for production setting. Here's a situation where we were doing monitoring demonstrations with neutron probe volumetric water, the standard tensiometer, and the watermark blocks, so we could compare how each of them correspond with each other. The watermark electrical resistance blocks do not require the maintenance that tensiometers do. Then you also have these different forms of time domain reflectometry and capacitance probe, FDR and salinity probes, and you 20 years ago, we were hooking these up to infield loggers and downloading them. Now, virtually everything is sent out over the web. So let's take a real quick look. This is a watermark example in some citrus. There's a Hansen logger on the right, the watermark monitor logger on the left. The watermark monitor system is the cheapest, least expensive, continuous monitoring system you can get. For about $800, you can get this logger, and you can get 6 watermarks, monitor 2 different trees down to 3 different depths for about $800. But you gotta check the readings in the field. So where do I monitor in these large fields? You've got this kind of different spread on the fan jets. Here's a neutron probe that was mistakenly stuck right next to the fan jet. Here's one out in the berm that'll get hit by equipment. Here's one that's kind of in the middle of 2 fan jets and a capacitance probe right there. Do I need more watermarks going out into the middle? Here's pressure transducer tensiometers. You can get really carried away from this. So what we want to do for grower practicality, to keep this at a simple level, we went into this citrus orchard and we just implemented one set of watermarks on a low elevation part of one hose, went to the same hose on the high elevation part and put the other watermarks. They're about right here, they're about 3 foot away from the, he was using a blue tensiometer, a blue fan jets on this particular field. So you got to use a really silty soil to get good contact when you're in this coarser sandy soil. And we came up with different pictures like this. Here's an irrigation, here's depletion, irrigation, depletion. So when you look at the season long for this particular citrus block, here is basically the readings at a 15-inch and 30-inch depth, showing perfect recharge every irrigation. he was irrigating about 12 hours, if I remember, at this point in time, where you would pop up fairly quickly with the 18-inch, and then the sharp curve here shows drainage down to the 30-inch. But the 30 would just hit fill, and then it shows the use by the roots. Again, just hit fill, use by the roots. So we filled to 30 inches perfectly every irrigation. Now, if you compare it to the low elevation part of the field, this was the high elevation area, and I'm sorry, 24-hour sets. You can see that some of the 30 inches we had a sharp drop off. So here we're perking water, and when we fertigate, we're perking nitrogen below that 30-inch depth. And for these particular navels, they were really operating on only about 30 to 36 inches. So put something out there in the field, something with the continuous monitoring helps look at those kinds of trends, but at least get out there, do your hand probing every week. Here's another example where watermarks didn't tell us a whole hell of a lot. This was loam, silty loam, clay loam soil, and basically this citrus was just too wet the whole time. I couldn't get the grower to back off the irrigation, so would it work better or not? Here is that flood almond field we saw earlier, where you actually have soil infiltration problems. These are about a 10-hour run on the water and shut off. This was a 90% to 95% DU field, and with gypsum I was able to infiltrate 44 inches. Without gypsum we only got 41, but you can see here where the grower was on less frequent irrigation. With gypsum the depletion wasn't quite as bad, but without gypsum, we really crashed on infiltration until the grower picked up the frequency in here. So it all goes back to how big this cup is. And we've talked about this before. So if I understand the perfect drainage, which is plant roots pulling the water out, and my perfect run time to put the water back, then I know what I'm talking about. Okay, now all that watermark stuff, tensiometers, that's soil moisture tension, but the cup needs to measure volume. So there are ways to translate the soil texture and what that water tension is, and really with watermark we're dealing right in here, the 200 maximum. Tensiometers, you're only dealing 100 maximum, and so this tells you what those equivalent moisture tensions are for how much water inches per foot you got in that dirt. That's on my website also. So a neutron probe or a capacitance probe gives you that direct measurement of the volumetric soil water. So all this stuff, I mean, it can ramp up real quick. You might end up $5,000 to $10,000 in all this technology that's out there. And if you get the perfect setting with some of these capacitance and TDR probes, you can get very detailed records like this that show you at your different depths, 12, 24, 36, 48, just where your water's going, and whether I'm popping water out the 48-inch depth or not. Every time I pop water here, if I've got a 5-foot root zone, as many of our mature almond orchards do, well, okay, they're still using that water, but this little peak is telling you I just pushed water and nitrogen, if I did my fertigation, below that 48-inch depth. So just real quickly, a little bit of advertisement. We're trying to make some of this monitoring imagery stuff more palpable by putting on a irrigation monitoring demonstration in 3 pistachio fields from east side to west side. We started last year. This is kind of what it looks like. You can go to this website here and look at an explanation of how this demonstration is trying to give you a comparison of soil moisture tension, soil moisture volume, and plant images, phytech dendrometers for the shrink swell. These are where the fields are located across pretty much east side to west side along 198 here, out to the far west side by Pleasant Valley. And we have a boatload of instrumentation out there that no farmer in his right mind would ever come close to. But we're trying to give you a comparison of the tensiometers, watermarks, Syntec drill and drop, capacitance probe, the phytech dendrometers, and this eddy covariance energy flux tower, which is measuring the water vapor directly leaving that orchard. And then we've got neutron probe access tube to 9 feet. So I'm actually generating numbers down to 9 feet. This is what some of the comparisons look like, and the capacitance measurement somewhat jibes with the tensiometric, but in this particular clay loam field, the tensiometric measurements may be a little more sensitive than the volumetric measurements. But basically, this set time of 24 to often 48 hours in a single line drip system is pushing water out to 46-inch depth. My neutron probe measurements show that water starts at 6 to 7 foot, and that's about the depth of the root zone at this place. Here's another field that's a salty field, and the capacitance is almost flatlined. The tensiometric is a little better, and this is what the Jane Logic website looks like if you have a contract with them and you can get some change in that water content from this happens to be this east side field, this 80 acres right here. I'm not going to dwell on all that stuff in the Jane system. Here is that east side field, and what I want to show you real quickly is we've got the NDVI image here as of July 18th, 2019, and here's the equivalent water stress. So here's the stem water potentials, 9.5 to 11 bars, and this is the 80 acres we're focused on the west side. We've got a no cover crop versus cover crop 40. So this entire quarter section is evaluated for water stress. Here's the wettest field, and this one shows it's a little on the drier side, but we're still mostly green, so not too bad. Now, what happens if we look at comparative water stress from July 18th to September 6th to this year, April 25th? I want to use this imagery to make sure I'm up to date on my water for that block. And we had a great crop last year. This is 5,500 pound in shell out of our test plot area in here. So this September image, just a couple weeks before, actually a week before we were shaken, is great. Now I look at all this yellow. Whoa, all this yellow. Does that mean I'm really stressed here? But look at the stem water potentials. The stem water potentials are much lower. So what happens is when these imagery companies do this kind of analysis to give you a color scale, they'll come up with a frequency distribution. Here's the frequency distribution for July 18th, and for the cover crop 40 acres southeast, it's pretty close to the same as the non-cover 120 acres. And so your division of blue, green, yellow, red, not too much difference across those two fields. But in the April image, look at what happened. We have the non-cover, which is showing some of the dirt in between the trees, being almost all at a higher canopy temperature, that's this one here, than what the cover crop area was. And so what that does, that results in this kind of image. My leaf expansion on 425 was only about 75%. So in the non-cover areas, I'm seeing a lot of hot dirt. And the series imagery does a pretty good job of scrubbing out the dirt pixels, but that still contributes to the heat in that entire area. So this cover crop zone at 9 bars in the center area skewed this whole area. So now this guy looks hot compared to him, and looks hot compared to last September. But it was really kind of an artifact of this particular extra blue, real cool area in this field. When you retool the frequency distribution with this 80 acres separately from this guy right here, now you come up with much more blue and green, and you say, oh, okay, no problem with my water here. So aerial imageries are not always perfect. The relative comparison of a given image at a given time for a whole field is still very accurate. But from one time to the next, it can have a problem. The agrologic guys are trying to solve this. They say they've got a constant blue scale, and they are now combining with the Jane Irrigation people to provide this data on a weekly basis with a constant scale and a uniformity of what that water is for every 5 to 10 days, depending on when the satellite goes over. So much larger pixels. The clouds can cover some of these images. That's what these white areas are. And they're also looking at this hyperview, NDVI, growth vigor thing. And what they're giving you right now is a combined Excel spreadsheet tracking of that uniformity and of the field ET. These are our 3 fields. This is the east side, non-saline we've been looking at. This is west side, Pleasant Valley, higher ET, and this is saline affected field near Lemoore. So the point is, there's a lot better tools than this one. And you've got to use a better tool than this one to keep track of those numbers and figure out if you're improving or getting behind. Very quickly, let's go through crop water requirements here. The ET is that stomatal conductance, the water vapor thrown out from the leaves. The E, like you saw in those Fanjet young irrigated almonds. The ET for those young almonds, the E is a whole lot bigger than the T. That's where drip irrigation gives you advantage, because the T is what produces your yield and trees and sugar. You really have so many tools out there now. We're long past the caveman days where you just kicked the clod and dug a shovel into maybe a foot and tried to tell you what was going on. The Simus 20-year average back in 1993 was 49 inches of ET for the San Joaquin Valley for a normal year. Now in 1993, when we've got more data, so we have these automated weather stations now measuring humidity, solar radiation, and using what we call a Penman-Monteith calculation with this graphs fetch to calculate the ET. There are 121 active Simus stations across California. There have been more than almost 200 at one point in time. So you are pretty close to a Simus station. They have these normal year ATs estimated by these zones. Most of the San Joaquin Valley tends to use this zone 15. This west side, Kings County, Hanford Zone 16. Some of these zones are actually being retooled right now. But the bottom line is it's 53 to 62 and a half inches a year is now what Simus is saying for these true normal year ETO. So here's the bottom line. If you take region 15 and look at the old 1993 pan data by itself, that was 49 inches here, and the updated 99 number was 58 inches. Is this global warming? Maybe partly, but it's also better data collection. So what that does is it means you need to try and if you're going to figure the ET of the crop, how much you've got to replace in that cup to refill it every irrigation, then you take that ETO from the CIMMYS. You can sign on for an account. They love people signing on for data accounts. It's free. You take the best crop coefficient that we have currently, and new crop coefficients are just getting ready to be published for pistachios. They're a little different from the old ones, and the almond ones are out there. There's also grape ones out there. Go to my website, you can pull down those coefficients, multiply by an efficiency factor. Most growers are figuring I'm 90-95% efficient, so that would mean you'd want to multiply these numbers by maybe 1.1 to 1.1, 10% if you're getting 90% efficiency factor. Some growers just use these numbers straight off as replacement with their microsystem, and then they make sure they do a proper job of winter recharge. As I said, you can get these ET tables from my website. Okay. Is a crop coefficient biblical writ? Every field of a given citrus orchard with maturity, the same maturity and cover, has the same KC? They do not. Your soil make a difference. The varieties can make a difference. The wind run of that particular area can make a difference. It's not always captured by the ETO. Here's some comparative curves of citrus from July 23rd to July 26th. Look at this. 23rd, it was a little less than 10 millimeters. 26th, it was almost 15 millimeters. That's 50% more. And the actual change in the CIMMYS ETO wasn't that much different. So, okay, that's one particular day. What if you're looking the whole season long? If you look at this trial that was done by Rick Snyder, the current published crop coefficient is 0.65 for in season, 0.75 in late fall, early spring, and these high yields that were knocked out over 4 years were all irrigated at a 0.75 to 0.85 crop coefficient. So there, and they measured that effective ET. You look at the boxes of oranges, the tree responded with increased yield. Now, the only way you're going to be able to capitalize on this, if you've got one of those blocks with that kind of guts, is you go out and you check the stress on the trees, feel them with your hand. You can feel whether they're hot or not. Have an automated probe, have a Hortown system for tensiometric readings, but some way check and see if those trees are drying out. Because if they are, you probably are at a point where understanding how to use a pressure bomb or some way to check the trees, phytech dendrometers, you come back with more water and get your growth on and carbon dioxide uptake on a more optimal track. Yes, it will cost you water. There are these stem water potential recommendations available from my website, many other people's website, and I know a lot more people are using the stem water potential reading these days. Little aside, do protective reflective coating to surround, sprayed on pistachios or almonds, cut down the ET because you're reflecting some of the heat? No. Here is control. Control is the X's, I'm sorry, the triangles here, the squares here, on here, two different irrigation measurements. And if you look at this stem water potential, measure of stress, it's exactly the same for the surround versus non-surround, and it's only made different by putting on adequate water here versus the stress water here. So the magic snake oils that claim to reduce plant stress really don't work in my book. I've never yet seen one that does. So look at a Kern County early Beck trial where we did a difference of 22 down to 16 inches. Not a whole lot of different irrigation. That's only 7 inches. I'm sorry, 5 inches, 6. I'll get it right. It's a 6 inches difference in irrigation from May 23 to October 30th. That's when we started the trial here. For 2007, we were able to capture the whole year, and we irrigated this field with a combination of our recommendation at 0.75 kc plus the grower's hand probing, and you can see we had everything from 42 down to 25 inch irrigation, and we had very clear separation on the stem water potential stress throughout the whole season. And the yields and the end of the day reflected it. Very different. We had almost 100 box difference in the turnout of class 1 88s for, I'm sorry, my apologies. This is pounds per tree in this slide. So in pounds per tree, we had 100 pounds more on the ones that had sufficient irrigation. So how are you going to know if that irrigation is sufficient, required, or technically, by the current crop coefficient readings, that orange field was over-irrigated? But if you have some kind of instrumentation out in the field, your hand probing record, you can prove that it's not. So this normal year idea is a good place to start, but you got to check all this stuff as you're going through. And here's the bottom line: if you do not have a system of record keeping to tell you whether your checking is keeping you on track, is improving yield, is just making things wetter, or getting drier, or holding that level of soil moisture and plant stress perfectly, if you don't have a boilerplate set up for that field, you're not going to get anywhere, because you're not going to know how well you're doing over time. You wouldn't buy an engine without a boilerplate on it telling you the horsepower requirement and the load it can bear. So this is your field boilerplate: your soil type, rooting depth, available, non-available, refill point, irrigation system runtime, here preferred, fan jets, what it applies in terms of your design rate. So the reason I put this up here is I have on my website a San Joaquin Valley checkbook irrigation scheduler. If you want to download it, we'll look at the Excel sheet in a moment, but the 6 main steps are outlined right here. Area covered by the crop, volume of the water stored in the root zone. We talked about that with the drip and micro sprinklers before. Flow of the water to this area, either infiltration, flood, or the application rate, micro. Usual set duration that works for you. Expected crop water use, because you got to plan ahead to give the water district your schedule. So use the normal year in the KC, but if your block tends to be more vigorous, then you can up that with a vigor factor, as I'll show you here. So then you need real-time feedback, hand probe or tensiometer readings that tell you what your actual current soil moisture is. So here's an example with some almonds. Here's that boilerplate of everything that's going in there, and this almond field, I put it a 5% vigor. So that 5% vigor actually takes the classic crop coefficients and the normal year ETO, and it adds 5% to them. So this shows you what your weekly ET's expected is for that block. And here's the hours you need to run that system to refill. So you crank in your hours here, and this calculates the deficit or surplus, and it adjusts what your estimated soil moisture depletion is, and then percent of where it ends up. So I hand probe, and I said, no, I got 90% instead of 79. Then this calculator will adjust to say, oh, okay, I'm not 79%. Otherwise, this would be drier. This would be down to 60-some%. But it grabs the update, and then I said 97 here, but oh, it's 100. I thought, whoa, I'm really sucking water here. I didn't irrigate with harvest. My hand probing said I had 40%. That's a little better benefit. So this kind of technique helps you adjust. Here's an example for citrus. And here is what my version of update looks like. So I can see my stored soil moisture plus my applied inches, and I can see whether I went deficit or if I kept straight across. This is actually some stress in this field, and I say, oh crap, I finally get the grower to come back on with some 48-hour sets and pump back up the water content just before harvest cutoff out here. So one way or the other, get some way to track this. Look at the links that Provo and Pritchard are giving you for my website. You can get the scheduler. But your shadow in the field is still the most valuable thing you can put out there. To probe it, feel the leaves, see where the fruit is going, and in the end of the day, some simple economic conclusions. Your soil moisture equipment could be $800 to $600. But if you look at the bottom line down here, water savings in some cases can pay you back. Likely though, you're already on the skinny edge of your irrigation if you're doing micro irrigation. And you may actually end up putting on more water, but an extra 150 boxes of 88s at $2 net on 150 acres is $45,000. An extra 200 pound per acre almonds on your 150 acres at $2, $60,000. So a picture of where you are, the reality of what's going on in that field, can easily be worth many thousands of dollars. Thank you.